Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This is the 2021 National Committee on U.S.-China Relations China Town Hall affiliate event on America, China, and the global tech economy. So this discussion is part of the National Committee's China Town Hall series, and it is sponsored by the University of San Francisco's China Business Studies Initiative, and also by the Bay Area Council. First, I'm going to pass it off to Charles T. Moses, the Dean of the University of San Francisco's School of Management, to tell you a little bit more about the main sponsoring organization, which is USF's China Business Studies Initiative.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm excited to be here with you. This is an ongoing discussion. It seems like every week I'm talking with someone about U.S.-China trade relations, particularly since I joined USF a couple of years ago, and it's a very exciting time. I know that you all have been talking about U.S.-China relations. I'm not going to try to advance that discussion. I know it's probably been discussed quite a bit this afternoon. But I will say that we're very proud to be a sponsor of this wonderful event. China, in particular, Asia in general, is very high on our agenda. USF is an international school. We have thousands of alumni in China and in Asia. We are very always interested to know and to play a role in promulgating rich relations between the two countries. China Business Studies Initiative, is one of four centers of excellence within the School of Management at the University of San Francisco. I think it's about 8 years old. And what it does, and it's rather unique in that it tries to facilitate rich discussions and understanding and networking between businesses, primarily in the Bay Area, San Francisco, one of the most dynamic business environments in the world, and China. And we've been at it now for 8 years, very excited. I'll tell you a little anecdote. The week that I got USF, the China Business Studies Initiative was hosting a breakfast on campus. And I didn't get much of an orientation when I came to USF. Into my first week, late in the afternoon, 2 FBI agents come to my office and asked me what we were doing hosting a breakfast the next day on China. And I said, well, I didn't really know that much about it. I thought there was a faculty member who had gone wayward or gone rogue, and they wanted to arrest him. I was happy to turn him over had that been the case, but it wasn't the case. What it was that this was a very high level delegation from China and the American Chamber of Commerce, people with a lot of weight, a lot of gravitas in the room for that luncheon, and they were interested in seeing what was being discussed. This is right at the beginning of the current trade war, and so I guess they were collecting intelligence, but it gave me a sense for the gravitas of this initiative. And I have been honored in the 24 months since to work alongside with Professor Yang and the China Business Studies team. And we're very hopeful over the next year that we will elevate the China Business Studies Initiative to a center of excellence within the university. And we're working towards that. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. So this is good work. This is good stuff. It's probably the most important bilateral relationship. You notice I'm using the word bilateral. It's important. It is a bilateral relationship, a reciprocal relationship. And we want to deepen that and add to that by promoting richer networks and mutually beneficial relationships between U.S. and China businesses, particularly those in the Bay Area. So I'm glad to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to a really productive continuing discussions this afternoon. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dean Moses. As context, many of you, but not all of you, may have just seen Fareed Zakaria in the national interview. If you haven't, that will be archived, so you can go back and take a look at that later. So Zakaria was talking about kind of the big picture of U.S.-China relations, state-to-state relations, the security issues, the economic issues, trade negotiations, and all that. What we're going to do in this session is to follow up and really focus in on what is kind of dear to our heart here in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the tech sector. And so that'll be what we'll be focusing on. Obviously, of great concern in our town to local people here, but also an issue of great national importance. So who am I? I'm Peter Lawrenson. I'm from the Department of Economics at the University of San Francisco. I'm the director of our master's program in applied economics, which focuses on the digital economy. And I'm an executive board member with USF's China Business Studies Initiative. We have 4 panelists today here, each of whom have substantial expertise I think in almost every case, in multiple different areas of the U.S.-China tech relationship, in business, in journalism, in academia, and in policy. So I'm going to introduce them in turn, and they'll be, but just briefly, and we'll put up links to their bios so you can learn all about the amazing things that they've done in the past. They all have very rich careers. So first, we have Darlene Chu Bryant. She's a native San Franciscan and a USF alum who now leads Global SF, which is an organization that is a public-private partnership that tries to foster international investments in the Bay Area and also encourage and support Bay Area firms in increasing their international presence. David Wertheim is the executive director of the new tech-oriented journalistic outlet Protocol, focusing on the China area still. Sam Sachs is a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. And Xiaomeng Lu is director in Eurasia Group's geotechnology practice. And Xiaomeng may be popping in and out in terms of video because she's currently stuck in a quarantine hotel in China. Just perfect illustration of the barriers that we all face towards constructive interaction between the two countries now. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join me today. I thought I'd kick it off to talk about I mean, there's just been so much going on the past year in China tech and with the U.S.-China relationship. I started putting down a list today, and it's a huge long list, but I'm sure I missed something. But things that have happened have been a lot of developments in data governance and privacy issues, with both sides having their own views of how to regulate it and wanting more control for their side for fear of what the other side will do. Cybersecurity, new regulations in China of companies' algorithms that are core to their business model. This new slogan of common prosperity, antitrust actions, a crackdown on video game use by children, crackdown on sort of online fan culture ban, Didi Chuxing having their big IPO, and then a couple days later being smacked down for their own perceived violations. Meng Wanzhou was released. Last week, LinkedIn exited China, and I know even in all this list, I missed some things that probably consumed my week or seemed like the event of the year already. So, what do you guys see as the most important or surprising development in the past year, and why? And if it's not on this list, open to learning about it. I'll take a volunteer, or I'll be professor and call on you in turn. David, why don't you get started?
Thanks, Peter. Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, you listed a lot of the major developments that have been keeping me busy in the news business, and I think when I think about what's been most surprising, it really has been, well, first of all, I feel very good about starting a media outlet focused on technology in China, and in particular focused on the Chinese regulatory state. Because the same thing that has given me a few extra gray hairs and taken a few hours out of my sleep schedule has been the thing that sort of validated this approach, which is, oh my goodness, something that seemed both technology in the China context and sort of helping readers understand the regulatory state seemed to be something that was somewhat niche. Although, for example, DigiChina out of Stanford, Sam have done amazing work. There weren't that many practitioners. It wasn't in the headlines that often. And it feels like really starting with the crackdown on Ant Financial, there's just been the floodgates have opened. And I think it's a combination of increasing awareness among Americans that this stuff matters and that this stuff affects global business, and really a more spirited activism by an increasingly confident and assertive Chinese regulatory state. So I would actually just take a red pen and sort of draw a line around all the things that you mentioned and say, all of this has really happened in the last few months, not even just this year. And I think that to me is sort of the most amazing development.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
You know, I second what David said about, I think my biggest surprise is that suddenly I'm speaking with journalists that care about something obscure called the cybersecurity review measures. You know, no one really was following the twists and turns of China's opaque cyber regulatory framework before this year. But I will say that it seems like all of the sudden out of nowhere, we have these, you know, the so-called crackdowns. But the reality is, I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, there is a recent spike, which has its own storyline. But many of the regulatory tools that are in play have actually been underway as far as they've been in the drafting process, or they've been in the sort of build out of this regulatory system for at least 5 years. And so colleagues at Digi China, you know, we've been looking at the cybersecurity law as the centerpiece of this matrix, which has really been, that law took effect in 2017. And many of the tools that are now sort of front and center in stories about Didi or Ant Financial, you know, the cybersecurity review, or this fall, the China's privacy law and the data security law, or the critical information infrastructure regs. I'm not going to go down this sort of obscure rabbit hole, but these are part of a scaffolding that was set up 5 years ago. And many of these tools from, you know, practitioners and industry have been sort of waiting for the emerging pieces of this puzzle to come to fruition. So I think it's important, as we look at some of the very high profile stories around these, you know, consumer brand companies, to keep in mind that there are different types of stories at play, and some of them have to do with the politics of the moment, and some of them are very much sort of slow burning stories, which are on their own trajectory and are colliding with a political story today, if that makes sense.
So would it be a fair summary for you to say that you think there's not a crackdown, that just kind of coincidentally a lot of things happened at the same time?
I think what I would say is there are many different crackdowns, right? You have just as an example, we have a more assertive SAMR, which is sort of which is charged with looking at antitrust and monopoly issues. We have a data security campaign. You know, for 2 to 3 years, there's actually been a mobile app campaign underway around excessive collection of personal data. Now you have more scrutiny on foreign IPOs, and that's collided with this scrutiny on how the platforms are handling their data and whether they've been in compliance or not. I'm talking too much. I don't want to hog this, so I should turn it over to somebody else at this point. But there are multiple different forms and tools at play with different trajectories.
Great, Darlene, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I use the term, I don't know if I coined it or whatever, but the one term I call China is the system is currently a capitalistic communism. That's what I call it. And what does that mean? That it will always forever be a communist state. And the thing is, in order for China to keep its people happy, they have to be capitalist, or what is perceived to be capitalist. And I think that a lot of the crackdowns that we saw, first of all, the biggest shock to me was the Ant Financial deal, or lack thereof, at the end of the day, right? But that was also sending a message, because here you are, they're still a communist state. And even though they're saying, yeah, we're going to let you innovate, we're going to let you make money, at the end of the day, they want to make sure that you remember who is the boss and who is allowing you to make money. And I think that, you know, for a lot of foreigners, for example, when they're saying, oh my God, what the heck happened there? And, you know, it's so surprising. At the end of the day, you think about it and said, no, once you understand the culture of China, you understand that that is definitely something that had to happen. At the end of the day, everything that happens in China is political, period, full stop. So my 2 cents.
Great, yeah, political, but then also, of course, you need the economy to be running to stay in political power.
Right.
Xiaomeng, I just see a phone number for you. Are you able to join us? Okay, I think she may be having connection troubles. So yeah, so many different things going on. So there's this crackdown, I guess. So Sam, you're saying there's actually, we should think of it as many different crackdowns. Yeah, so what maybe you could outline for us, like what are sort of 2 or 3 of the main crackdowns and kind of things that people in business or in policy should sort of be aware of and actually be careful to disentangle when they rather than just kind of generally thinking like Xi Jinping hates kids and their devices or whatever it is that however you might want to summarize it.
I hate kids and my devices. I would love to borrow some of these tactics and apply them in our context for my children. And that's actually an interesting question, right? Like, to what extent, and I think there was even a Republican representative in one of the hearings recently who opened up his questions, and he said, we've been trying to sort of, why is it that China is able to control the way that children are going online with video games, and we can't get our act together to do this? And I'm not suggesting that we mimic the system underway in China, but I think it is interesting to watch these sort of parallel developments as we have a, Facebook whistleblower testifying about algorithmic harms and the way that that's incentivizing, bulimia and suicides and all types of problems with teenagers' mental health, when the Chinese government is also looking at controlling the way that children engage online. And there's an interesting question to be raised about, how these intersect and the interaction among them. That's not what you asked, but about the various crackdowns, right? So the one that my colleagues at Digi China and I have been following closely, of course, for years is around the build out of China's data protection regime. And I think this was really interesting in watching what happened with Didi. Because this is where, Didi, its IPO, that sort of the controversy around its IPO came to a fore. And I think one of the big questions has been, people understand that the type of data that Didi has is potentially very sensitive from a national security standpoint. If you think about geographically sensitive locations, being able to triangulate that with where certain individuals are going. This for a long time has been a concern for the Chinese government. What does this have to do with a foreign IPO? And my sense is there was a lot of confusion by Chinese regulators about what kind of data specifically Didi would be compelled to disclose in the process of listing overseas. And that there were almost sort of like 2 different stories going on. You have the controversy around Chinese firms listing in the US and disclosures of the financial audits and refusing to submit to certain financial audits. But when I talked with officials in Washington about this, who had been talking for years with their counterparts in China, they were sort of taken aback because they said, none of the data that the Chinese government deems as sensitive that Didi has would have been required to be disclosed in the process of these financial audits. So what's the issue? Mapping data held on the platform is not part of the financial audit. And then when I talked with colleagues in China, I got the sense that they were asking me, well, exactly, there's almost this sort of obsession with foreign extraction of this sort of national security data. But I think that this is, again, this is sort of the problem of sort of not talking to each other, of not having very basic conversations about different pieces of each other's systems. You have the emboldened Cyberspace Administration of China. My sense is the CAC has not been involved in the kinds of conversations that CSRC had been having about data and financial audits, and may not have understood what data would have been disclosed. This is all a way of saying you have more concern in China about foreign extraction of Chinese citizen data colliding with a very high profile IPO, where Didi may not have checked all of the boxes it needed ahead of time and rushed this through. Also, for several years, Didi had been flouting Chinese government requirements around data security. Passengers were murdered on Didi's platform a few years ago, and they refused to turn over data to police in the context of that investigation. So what came out of this in the end is an updated cybersecurity review regime, which now will evaluate what are the data security risks when Chinese companies list overseas. So that's just one small example, but this is what I mean. When we think of the crackdowns, every piece of this crackdown has its own sort of ecosystem of players and politics and dynamics, which make it very hard to treat as sort of a monolithic crackdown.
Maybe just to piggyback on what Sam said, I mean, I think that what happened to Didi is a particularly interesting case in point, because the Chinese state is not monolithic. It's run by humans that have their own occasionally internecine rivalries and turf wars. And I think, and Sam can probably speak to this more eloquently than I can, but what we saw with Didi was an example of, I think ultimately there were 7 regulators involved, including Ministry of State Security, CSRC, CAC, obviously Department of Transportation. And, Didi, I think, was given some kind of implicit go-ahead from CSRC, but a verbal, caution flag from CAC. And so these regulators are not necessarily always talking to each other, always coordinating with each other. And there can be sort of jealousies in an effort to agglomerate power that actually enter into these so-called crackdowns and have an effect. Of course, these companies end up getting caught in the middle.
Just a quick acronym check here. So the CSRC is the China Securities Regulatory Commission, and then the CAC is the Cyberspace Administration of China, right? So both important regulatory agencies with different roles, but obviously both with a big interest in something like Didi's IPO. I'm going to check in with Xiaomeng again, see if she managed to join in.
And Peter, could I respond to one other thing that Sam said that I thought was really interesting? Because Sam, you mentioned that some American parents expressed a somewhat ironic but not totally ironic and joking jealousy over the ability that the Chinese state ostensibly has to stop young people from gaming, although Chinese families and kids have already come up with several clever workarounds, including renting adult accounts and getting their parents to scan them in and all that stuff. But I think what's interesting, it does, of course, I am not implying in any way, shape, or form that these rules make sense in the American context and are therefore good rules. What I'm saying is, I think that the gaming regulations are not the only example of regulations that are in some cases attacking problem areas that the US regulatory apparatus, often for political reasons, has not yet been able to attack. So you see, regulation of algorithms, although that's a 3-year timeframe, which Sam, I think, as you have said in the media, is ambitious, right? But they're trying to do that. This is for to comport with core socialist values. You have privacy regulations that exist. The personal information protection law, that is consciously sort of based on a European model and provides something more comprehensive than what federal legislation exists in the United States. And you've got some anti-monopoly laws, at least, that crack down on practices that sometimes are also endemic in the US that sort of infuriate internet users worldwide. And so I think one of the reasons that not only has this architecture that's been built over several years really started to show its weight and started to empower regulators and sort of launch different crackdowns, but also I think it's interesting to an American audience because we're not seeing regulation domestically. And so here's this other superpower that's doing something. It might not be right, but it's capturing our attention.
Right, and exactly, a lot of the things that they're doing are things that, right, we might not have done it the same way, but they're maybe less motivated by some kind of hostility towards the tech sector or desire to take down specific individuals. At least that's not the primary motivation, but also just to regulate stuff that some of it we're already regulating in the U.S. and just like with everything in China, right, still a communist capitalist country or a post-communist country or an evolving, mixed market planned economy. And so, they came out of the 80s and 90s without laws on stuff that, we've had laws on in the West for, 100 or 200 years. And then on top of that, now they're playing catch up just as we are and trying to figure out, okay, how does all this, even the frameworks that might have worked somewhere else, how do we adapt them to China, and then address the new technological environment. Darlene, you have something to say?
Well, the thing is, I just wanted to raise, the privacy laws, right, that we have in the U.S. I mean, at the end of the day, we are a democratic society and we have a democratic government. And so many things that are regulated, for example, in Singapore and in China, we would never think of regulating here because, no way are we going to let the government be able to track us every single step we make, even though maybe being done is just without our knowledge, but we're not going to go into that now, right? For example, and one very recent example I'll use is that, in Singapore, for example, one of the reasons why they've done such a good job in terms of containing the pandemic is because every single person was literally tracked. From the moment, if you were coming from overseas and you had to go through a 2-week quarantine, you got a call every single day, right? And you had to FaceTime, allow the officer to FaceTime you to show that you were actually in the house. Would we ever let that happen in the US? I don't think so. I mean, the fact that we actually have an app on our phone, right, that says, hey, you have not been exposed to anyone with COVID, in the last 24 hours, I think is already a step further than I would have expected, we would have allowed. But just to say, it's just the world that we're in versus the world that China is in, it's so different, and in that regard, it will determine, or in terms of technology, in terms of regulation, it just moves into different directions because of what the people will allow or not allow. So,
yeah, it always struck me in the it seems like in the U.S. we'll give companies any kind of information, but we're terrified of the government knowing even just basic stuff like
right.
What is my name and where do I live?
Right.
Somehow becomes controversial. Whereas then in Europe, it seems sort of the opposite, where they were fine with the government knowing everything, but were very concerned about companies. And then for a while, there was kind of a consensus of like, oh, Chinese people just don't care about anything. They're used to pervasive surveillance in every possible aspect of their lives, and whether it's companies or, the government, it doesn't really bother them. But it seems like, but now actually that's kind of seems to be changing. They're, Chinese people as citizens and consumers are becoming more aware and sensitive to these issues. And also the government is realizing that, if companies control the information and they can't access it, that could be a big problem, and potential shift of power away from where they thought it should be residing.
Right.
So another kind of big picture question: what's are some of the important things that that American people don't know about the tech sector in China? Not just sort of trends over the last year, but more broadly, that if you just maybe been reading, I was going to say Newsweek or whatever is left out there for like mainstream media. We're watching CNN, right? So you've seen Fareed Zakaria before, you watched his presentation, but things that you wouldn't know about the Chinese tech sector if you just kind of got interested in it this year and started to realize it was important. What's some important background and context that people should know about?
Maybe I can jump in for a second, Peter, because I think we were hitting at one of the developments, which is that we've learned that people in China do care about privacy, and they might not have the ability to constrain government in the way that we would demand in the United States, and they even might like in China, but that doesn't mean that they don't care about privacy. I think I'm not going to blame Fareed Zakaria for this, but I think some of what's happened in tech and understanding the Chinese tech scene requires kind of addressing some of the problematic ways that we've been thinking about the Chinese population, right? As a group of people who, generally speaking, don't care about privacy, generally speaking, will work as many hours as necessary to make as much money as necessary, generally very deferential to the business community. I think we're seeing a number of ways in which those assumptions are proving untrue. And I think, going back to first principles, to understand China's tech scene, I think it helps to acknowledge, as we're seeing, that the governing system in China is massively, massively different than the United States. And we can see that in a massively different response to a shared problem, to a similar problem of COVID-19. But also, I think we should reason from first principles to assume that Chinese folks generally have some of the same pet peeves and some of the same preferences that we would have anywhere else, right? So one thing that's really been interesting to me to watch has been workers organizing, right? Particularly in tech, where the 996 schedule, which means working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, which I think that scopes out to 72 hours a week, is that is an exhausting work schedule that the business community in China obviously embraced. It's technically illegal under China's overtime laws, and government's really starting to crack down, and workers are starting to organize to say, we've really had enough. I think you're seeing that. I think you're seeing a lot of pushback against, capital run amok, against shady practices of all sorts by major platforms. And so I think the best way to understand the sector is really to think, hey, what would annoy me? It's probably also annoying to folks in China. And then the question is just what tools do they have to address it?
One of the reasons, among others, that I'm such a fan of David's work at Protocol and before in his earlier positions is that I think he's done a really good job of bringing out so many different voices and perspectives in ways that really humanize China. And I think the problem with so much that I see in the media and this sort of noise coming out of think tanks and policymakers is this sort of treating China as this sort of static, monolithic, dehumanized, foil to the US. And it's frankly infuriating. One, because it's inaccurate, but also because it's just so damaging. And I think one of the things that I've sort of, tried to do is to sort of understand the different kind of, very different interests and sort of to give kind of texture to the sort of push and pull within the Chinese political system, whether you're talking about scholars, whether you're talking about different agencies within the government, whether you're talking about citizens who use these technologies. Something that I have struggled with recently is, there's been so much in going back to this question of the crackdown, right? I think there's this sense of, the party is dominating everything. And even some of these voices within the system that were able to say, push back on various security obligations or requests for data that in this current environment of total control, that's not possible. And I want to continue to push back on that even still, right? And to sort of say that there's a tendency to look at everything through this national security lens. And yes, there are security hardliners within the system who, if they had their way, would have that total control. But I would argue that there still very much is an element of push-pull, and you have other stakeholders who have economic development imperatives. So when we talk about the digital economy, for example, it's not all about cybersecurity. It's also about economic development. And that in of itself can be a backstop to some of the most far-reaching and worrisome provisions in these laws and regulations that we talk so much about. So like, if you talk to people that their job is to comply with the cybersecurity law or the various regulations connected to it on the ground in China, they will tell you about the sort of the gray zones and the negotiations and the ways in which the officials that they deal with on a daily basis have economic mandates that it's not necessarily in their interest to go as far as the sort of worst case scenario and the sort of drabble that comes out of Washington, D.C. when you go to congressional hearings. And it's also but it's always a yes and story. So those worrisome things, the sort of worst case scenarios, are also part of the picture. And I think it's just important to keep in mind the whole story. So that's, if I could, send a, congressional staffer to China in a pandemic, in this sort of fraught relationship with, US and China right now, I would just say, go and sort of spend some time inside, one of these companies and kind of understand what the reality is like. But at the same time, I also know that from talking with folks who work in these tech companies, in China, it's also really tense right now. And, I try to invite people to come and speak at my meetings. And I would love to have more participants from inside China's tech sector. And they're really scared right now to do that because it is such a draconian environment too. So it's the sort of yes and that I hope people can take away from the conversation and from sort of trying to understand what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think, just building a little bit on what you said, there's always this on the one hand, like we mentioned earlier, it's amazing to Americans that, oh, China is so top down, and sometimes that can be used to tremendous effect, right? With the crackdown on COVID, right? With the lockdown there, or with being able to implement laws that we probably think we might actually want to have here in some of our own version, but we just never be able to get the political coordination to do it, or stuff like older examples of like if we want to put in high-speed rail or build a bunch of new freeways or something, they just seem like boom, they could do it because they've got so much power. So then it's kind of true, and there's these big facts, but then then you get into something like, oh, whoops, we just let Didi list in the US, but now we're going to like slam them with all this stuff, or Ant Financial is about to list, and like this unpredictability that can come from the different interests kind of at parallel levels within, at similar levels or different silos, I guess, within the Chinese state, and then also the kind of conflicting imperatives, both, maybe there's a top-down vision, but there's also the kind of bottom-up pressures of what are people willing to tolerate and accommodate. That it just always makes things a little bit more complicated than one can explain in a 5-minute soundbite or a 20-minute of congressional testimony. So moving on to another question I had, what is, I mean, you just gave us, some bad news, Sam, and I've certainly heard many stories of that line. It does seem very tense in terms of US-China interactions in the tech space. What is still going on? I mean, we haven't 100% decoupled. There are still things still happening. So do you see anything, either that's happening more low key or that is positive, or just at least that's in maintenance mode that's worth noting?
Oh, was that to me or to Darlene?
That was to all of you, but why don't we have Darlene start, since your whole your mission is to foster those kinds of interactions specifically. So I don't want your job now. So how's it going?
I would say, well, now because I've moved on from just working on China related investment now to global investment, it's actually very serendipitous because it started right when the trade wars were beginning. But that being said, what I'll say is that Chinese investment, I would say, I don't want to say that the tap has been turned off, right? And the thing is that when it comes to technology, definitely the US is watching, especially from a CFIUS perspective. They want to make sure that Chinese money is not investing in US technology. Okay, totally understand. However, they will allow it in medtech, they'll allow it in biotech. And sometimes I wonder, I say, wait a minute, biotech also leads to national security too. So you're allowing China to invest in, biotech companies and medtech companies, but neither here nor there. I think that a couple of things. There still continues to be a lot of interest to invest in US, period. It doesn't matter what sector you're looking at, especially from China. Unfortunately, because of what has been happening in China, we see with, the recent stories of Evergrande, right? And I always say, okay, thank God they did not invest in San Francisco. I don't have to deal with that. However, one of the bigger and biggest investments that I had helped facilitate in San Francisco is Oceanwide. And they are having problems with even their general obligation bonds, right? And especially that were issued in Hong Kong. That being said, some of the smaller companies that are, I would like to say, more low key, they have been able to slide. I don't want to say slide because everybody's still struggling, especially with the pandemic, and nobody is having it easy. But then again, companies are still able to invest. Companies are still, especially if the money's already here, right? Landed already, that they continue to be interested in investing in companies, in M&A, and helping companies go public for that matter. And then just investing in technologies, whether joining funds or whether just investing directly in the companies, so SVPs, for example. So there is no lack of work, I would say. But what I will say is that less tire kicking delegations, which to me is better, because I don't want to meet with everybody and say the same thing and realize that 8 out of 10 are just, gathering information and not really investing anything, right? No real money to invest. So I actually am enjoying kind of the slowdown that way, and being able to, suss out the real investors versus the fake investors, because you never know what's going on. So anyway, so the bottom line is the work does continue. It's a lot less than before. And with what's going on, not just between the US and China, but even in China alone, where there are crackdowns, as we've been saying, right, on all the big companies, whether they're going to be tech, whether they're going to be real estate, whether they're going to be, MNCs, they still are being held back in many ways to really fully realize their investment potential.
I love those positive examples. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, we can. Glad to have you.
Oh gosh, after 15 tries, I figured out the right combination of network and VPN and phone bridge. It's a very complex project, but I'm so excited to be here. but I want to point you said on the positive side that there's still work going on. I have been on the ground of China for the past 2 weeks and try to connect with my business friends as much as I can, and I feel like there are some sign of positivity amid this great crackdown, as some of my coworkers called it. I think one thing I would like to raise is the algorithm regulatory proposal both Sam and David have been talking about. I think if you look at the way the officials envision this type of regulatory framework will play out in China, you can see they can roll out this type of regulation within a few months. Even there's practical challenge to implementation from the government side. And if it's fully implemented, it may even get ahead of the European AI regulatory proposal and become one of the first algorithm-focused regulatory framework to land to have the rubber meet the road in the world. In that sense, this is a very aggressive tightening effort from the government. But I also heard that the government official realized that it's really, really hard to execute some of these key provisions of the algorithm regulatory framework, like whether you are using algorithm or partially using algorithm to set up pricing scheme based on your customers' tolerance for higher prices. I think it's very hard to test technical. Like previously, Ministry of Industry and IT and CAC have find out this new software that can test how companies are gathering personal information from their user, and they use it as a very effective regulatory tool. But the practical challenge of implementing algorithm regulation as the way they propose is that they haven't developed that technical capacity yet. I think that's one thing. But another thing, I think at a higher level, I heard there are some leading scholars on AI governance, Chinese citizens, educated in the US from Tsinghua University that have been trying to push back on this very restrictive regulatory proposal. And such scholars have very high level political access to all the way up to the top leaders and share their thoughts on this front and try to walk them back from the most stringent requirement. I think that's one positive sign I have seen, probably the most positive thing I have seen in the past year or two. And then another issue, I think, in terms of the overall trend of this great technology crackdown or rectification campaign, if you want to call it, is that I think folks now start to concern the economic impact of this regulatory trend, because China's third quarter economic growth rate was 4.9%. That was a big jump from second quarter 8.9%, and before that was 14%. Overall, they are targeting 6% overall GDP growth this year, and they realized in the combination of regulatory crackdown in the tech sector and power outage, and also Evergrande sort of real estate market tightening, these efforts have been having a negative impact on China's economy. Maybe they're not going to do a sharp U-turn at the end of this year in the near term to say we are rolling back Common Prosperity campaign. I think that chance is pretty small. But if this economic growth slowdown trend continue, particularly after second half of next year, after the sensitive political period pass, I think there will be some sort of internal reckoning in terms of this type of regulatory styles impact on China's economic growth perspective. I think this is very much tied back into what Sam says. You see the press coverage all about national security and to a certain in the past few months, but the economic concerns are very much there. That this type of consideration is less talked about in the public space, but they pretty much still there, and they will act as some kind of moderating factor. That's a broader trend that's most visible to the audience in the U.S.
Great, thanks. Sam, David, Darlene, any thoughts on that? The development of the new algorithm regulation is certainly one of these examples of something where we don't know how to get it right either, and so it's going to be interesting to see how they try to do it.
I do think Xiaomeng made a good point about just the economic impact. I mean, one thing, Peter, I don't remember whether you mentioned it, but the crackdown on ed tech was, devastating for a lot of these companies and basically made them almost worthless or close to it from a market cap perspective. And now they're, selling, making and selling down coats online and trying to find ways to raise money after being, the cat's meow not too long ago. So that shows you something. I think, one other concern that I have mentioned occasionally in my writing is just, we're already seeing the impacts. That's a particular signal that there is an economic cost that the party will have to consider. I completely agree with Xiaomeng. Nothing's going to be changing in the next few months. It's a very politically sensitive time. Once she has sort of secured a so-called third term, some of that might lift. The party's never going to publicly say, oh, we made a mistake and we're going to roll back this policy. Sorry, but they will just quietly sunset or start to more loosely enforce certain things and develop other policies to take their place or emphasize other policies to take their place. But I do think there is also a long-term impact to consider that we don't talk a lot about because it's very hard to game out, which is just when it becomes so clear that the costs of being a publicly successful entrepreneur have become rather high, and a lot of people don't even want to be CEOs of the companies they founded anymore. And when the cost of being like a famous celebrity become rather high and you being disappeared from the internet, I do think on a long enough timeline, it does discourage the formation of new businesses and new ideas. And so I think, I don't know if anybody disagrees with me, but I think that's something that the party probably has talked about, but I don't know if there's a good way to put a number on that. And I think that's something that she might be playing a little bit dangerously there because the country's had blockbuster growth for so long. I think his confidence may not be entirely well placed because a lot of that is based on decisions that have been made over a period of years. He might be poisoning the well a little bit for the next generation of don't call them capitalists.
I think that's a very good point. And my observation is that I think there's some Chinese stakeholder pointed out also at a great political danger for themselves. For example, I think the very prominent Peking University economic professor Zhang Weiying has said that at the very beginning of the launch of the Common Prosperity campaign, that the term common prosperity, if it's not implemented properly, it can lead to common poverty. If you focus on the richest people, some of the leaders who you see are reaping the most of the economic benefit of China at the cost of the average workers and individuals. But you can take it too far. Especially these days, I think some of the term I heard is that when the lower level officials at the municipal level, local level, they get a political message from Beijing. Their interpretation is that when in doubt, turn left. If you don't quite understand what Beijing says, then take the leftist interpretation and carry forward, you will be politically safe. I think this amplifies the danger that you just mentioned, that you are pushing too far. You're targeting some of the most wealthy individuals. At the same time, you're targeting some of the most productive, most creative folks as well. And I think that internally there's discussion of that. And I think that's why in the past a few weeks, I think there's a little bit walk back from the top leadership level to tell people common prosperity does not mean that we are totally put equality in front of efficiency. We are not trying to get rid of efficiency, just focus entirely on equality. The analogy in China commonly used is we're trying to build up the pie, at the same time make sure that it's divided more equally among everyone. It's not going to, it seems to be two policy goals on par with each other. It's not giving out the economic growth entirely. I think that's I think he penned an article in Qiushi pretty recently, and also a few highly connected scholars put a few op-ed into the People's Daily column, kind of saying we're kind of make a little minor correction on the political messaging on this campaign a little bit, because the local level folks are interpreting it in a too far left way, and they realize that there's a minor connection to be made in order to address, I think, some of the concern from both domestically as well as foreign investors who also very, very much worry about the effect that David you just talked about.
Yeah, we're really sort of working through the same thing that we work through here, right? You know, how much do we want to, complain about the 1% and, make fun of Jeff Bezos for flying into space and things like that, while also appreciating, the things that many of these people have brought us in our daily lives, and not trying to pretend that, they're we don't want to stifle that. And I think China sounds like they're facing very much the same issue, while also, of course, wanting to maintain a level of equity and equality and opportunity that leaves makes people who aren't in that 1% feel like it's still a system that they can accept. So in our last few minutes, why don't we I'd like you guys to give some advice. So there's all sorts of things that the US and China do disagree on. We didn't go into them, but Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, lots of other stuff where we have grave concerns and often diametrically opposed interests or viewpoints. But where are the issues that we can potentially take on together? Or what are the sort of possible ways to move forward? What advice would you give either to the Chinese government or the US government, or maybe businesses and ordinary people on either side to help the relationship get back on a better footing? Darlene, go ahead.
I didn't know if I was ready, but anyway, I think that one way, if the US-China economies, so to speak, or if I were to pick a sector and industry, I'd say let's look at climate change. I know that China has been talking the talk and trying to walk the walk, even though I still question why they're using so much coal, but I do understand why. But electricity, they're using the solar, whether it be wind power or what have you. I think that the better we can collaborate, right, and maybe find ways to agree to actually co-invest in finding these new technologies and using them and sharing them, I think it would be a great way to move forward together. And I think, and another thing, I also find something that is bothersome, and that is the nationalism that we see in China, which is great. But when it is actually using fake news, right, that we've heard during the last administration. I find that really troubling, because here you are, we have Americans who actually believe, and some of us, or many of us, believe that we should be working alongside China. And I'm sure a lot of Chinese businessmen agree that we should be working alongside the US. But the thing is that you have a lot of the general population that actually are being given colored lenses because they do not have access to the news that other businessmen may have access to, for example, right? And don't really know the truth. And I think that, so what I'm asking for is more transparency on both sides of the Pacific versus what is that really happening now. So there you go.
And I think my practical advice, maybe I will take a bifurcated approach here. I want to say, I think in this geopolitical environment, the quasi decoupling status that we will live in for the, at least, I want to say, I think for business, the B2B type of business, it may be more practical to take a more nationalist approach, and because for them, government procurement market, it's a very profitable part of the market, and that could be a very generous source of revenue for this company. And in this political environment, it's hard for multinationals in the B2B sector to appeal to both US and Chinese government. I find trust between those if you are trying to serve both B2B, especially government procurement related market. I think just focused on one, I would say that the biggest B2B US company should try to stay with your home government, and that's probably the more promising route to profitability. And the Chinese company is likely to do the same. But I think for B2C companies, there may be a little bit space to maneuver. For example, companies like Tesla and Apple, they're doing quite well, I want to say, in China. They are still having quite a bit sway given the type of technology they specialize in and the traction they gained with the consumer market there. And they have done a lot of smart policy maneuver to mitigate various risks. And I think they are at a lower level of political, a lower level of exposure to geopolitical conflicts between these two countries. I think the same apply here. TikTok survived the divestiture and the ban during the Trump administration, and now the CFIUS conversation is still ongoing, but the app has been gaining insane popularity in the US, and it doesn't seem like the Biden administration think they are such a spectacular risk, the national security risk in the US. It seems that they may be able to pull this off to try to juggle the concerns from both government in a very, very weird position. But I think for this company, it keeps trying, right? If your conference system doesn't work, your VPN doesn't work, you need to try other technical routes, and I think those routes exist. And I tried that, and it worked in the last 20 minutes.
Fareed Zakaria said something earlier which really struck me. He said that China benefits when the US retreats into isolationism and protectionism, and while the rest of the world does not. And I really hope that the Biden administration was listening to that and can heed that. There are some areas in which there are genuine national security concerns, but from the outside, a lot of what's happening looks like protectionism. And it's going to be really important to be clear about that. I think about, for those of you who haven't read the spectacular transcript from the DC federal judge who basically overruled the ban on Xiaomi when the Department of Defense and the Trump administration declared Xiaomi as a Chinese Communist Party military company, read the transcript that this judge wrote. And he said, that he described the evidence that the Department of Defense had put forward in making this designation of Xiaomi. And he said, you basically pointed to an award that Xiaomi was given by the Chinese government, an award that 500 or so other entrepreneurs had been given, including a baby formula maker, a chili powder producer, and a wine company. So if we're going to go down this route of saying that every Chinese company is a military end user, let's get our evidence together. And I worry that if we don't, this is just going to end up making US components and software designed out from the rest of the world and so many other things that are actually going to make us less secure, less prosperous, and are going to do nothing to actually protect our privacy, by the way. If we want to protect American citizen sensitive data, let's pass federal privacy law. And that can also go a long way towards helping improve collaboration with the Europeans. So that's a mouthful, I know, but I think that's where I would begin.
Great, thanks, Sam. David, some last thoughts?
Yeah, if I could, give advice to the leaders of the respective countries, I think, for C, I'd probably say two things. One, mentioned earlier with Xiaomang, don't assume that China's economic success will continue. Don't take it for granted. It's not because Robin Li or Jack Ma don't have enough money, right? It's not actually about the so-called 1%. It's about the people who are not particularly rich, who are very young, who are thinking about their choices. Should I go start a company which will probably fail? Or should I go into a more stable government job? You need people forming companies. Most of them fail. A few of them have spectacular success. I do think new business formation and that dynamism is something that he's putting at risk a little bit. The other would be let the light, let some light back in. The expulsion of journalists from major outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, on a long enough timeline makes it harder for businesses to understand what they're investing in. It makes it harder for governments, including in Washington, to make good decisions. And you're actually just creating a generation of opinion makers and reporters whose sort of affections, not loyalties, but affections lie elsewhere because they can't ply their trade in China. I think for the US, I'd say, one, we have lots of really talented young Chinese people who want to come here and study here and research here and then live here. Like, go get them. Get as many as you can. Take the talent from Beijing if you're really worried about that, and make it, give them every reason to stay. Obviously, I don't think our confusing immigration system is going to get untangled, but it would be great if it could, and we could use that in a more strategic way. And then the other thing I'd say to the US is, we really need to invest, because we can't continue to just be reactive to Chinese technology advances and try to stop all of them. That's going to be very hard in a globalized economy. It's not just TikTok, right? But it's AI, cyber, quantum, the metaverse, which I think is going to be a big thing. That's a Chinese export, gaming, social and streaming. There's going to be lots of Chinese success stories. We need to just be minting our own and inventing our own stuff rather than worry too much about trying to veto China's technological rise, which we ultimately do not control.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have. So just want to say again, I really appreciate all of you coming to share your thoughts with us and with the members of the National Committee community and the University of San Francisco. And I think we have an audience from kind of all around the world and all kinds of different time zones. So thanks for staying up early or getting up early or staying up late. And hope I'll see a lot of you back again maybe next year.